So when we work with the federal agencies, what are programs that can benefit society at the National Science Foundation, National Institutes of Health, and other? I was writing speeches for members of Congress to help make the case to support those programs, talking with FFRDCs or other organizations that represented those communities and asking them what do they need or how can the government help or at least get out of the way. So that was a really formative experience for me. And before that, I was in grad school. My doctorate degree is in biomedical sciences. And I studied the genes that are important for infection in Lyme disease. So this was in the mid-90s, eons ago. Some of you maybe were in diapers at the time, but it was a mix of work, pipetting and wearing the white coat and gloves, and also doing some DNA analysis just on the computer, looking at genomic sequences and how those virulence genes or genes for infectivity were similar to known virulence genes in pathogens that we understood at that time. So how does that bring value to where I am today? So it brings an analytic mindset. It brings a healthy dose of natural skepticism, the ability to question, the comfort in being uncomfortable, the skill and experience of working in an academic community for 6 years. My parents are academics, grew up in a small town in middle Georgia. By many accounts, I'm an anomaly. Okay, I'm someone who is just a duck out of water. And I have embraced the world of security. And I bring that diverse background to thinking differently about risk. And because I love the world of security, I am really eager to learn about better software development processes, because that's where the bad guys are focusing. The hacker mindset. How do you identify what are the key risks to your organization? So that's what I do. I travel all around. I'm going to Seattle in the afternoon. I'm going to talk to a customer who is the head of a healthcare company in Seattle and ready to answer all questions that are cybersecurity related, because that's my job and that's what I love to do. So for this conference today, I wanted to share with you things that I've learned from working at a software company. Is that okay? So Veritas is a company that's been around 40 years. And it makes software that orchestrates backup and recovery. Now, even 10 or 20 years ago, that was a really boring topic. It was, for someone who's in the back recesses of the office, just like the Office movie clip that we saw earlier, the image. And a lot of people still think it's really boring. But when I was at CISA, which is the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, as a senior executive working in the field in the southeastern US during the Colonial Pipeline incidents, which is really important for critical infrastructure, I always would talk about how important it is to make sure that you're testing the backups, that you're including the backups in your tabletop exercises, and that you're ensuring that you can restore from those backups at scale. And so many organizations fail to do this. And so it's natural for me to come and work at a software company that makes backups. So that's very comfortable for me. But what has been uncomfortable over the past year is working for a software company, because there are many roles, many positions that I was just not even familiar. If you had asked me what channel was a year ago, I couldn't have told you. I didn't know what an SE or a sales engineer does and where the relationship begins and ends. So the big picture here is that there has been a lot to learn. And I think what would be of value to this particular audience is a little peek under the hood at some of the processes that our company has put in place during its software development, SecDevOps. I always like to talk about the threat landscape because you can't be well prepared unless you understand what threat actors are doing now. There's a great company called Picus Security that put out a red report last March. And there is a new practice by hackers that is really gaining tremendously in popularity, and that is the development of malware that specifically targets and disables security systems and security tools. So Picus Security published the top 10 attack techniques of threat actors after an analysis of more than 500,000 malware samples. And they found that the number one technique is process injection, injecting malware in a normal process so that it can be obfuscated. And I'm not going to go through all of these. Again, there was a top 10, but I just wanted to give you a snapshot of the top 5. I'm going to talk about a few of these, not all of them. So, number one, process injection. Let's dive a little deeper into what that means. So, the main tactics that are part of this overall attack technique are the privilege escalation. So, your sysadmin, someone comes and impersonates that person, or through a third-party application, gets into the network and looks around and finds who is the sysadmin, and then goes into their contact entry and adds another cell phone number, for example, so that they can overcome multi-factor authentication and be that person, and then just log into the system. Number one technique. So again, you can see in the lower right corner that process injection had a 32% increase from the prior year in this study in its prevalence. And as you would expect, system information discovery, something I alluded to just a moment ago, is that the behavior of the threat actor is they get into the network some way, and it's usually through privilege escalation, and then they surveil the environment. What are they looking for? What do you have that's valuable? That's the key question to answer, to figure out how to prioritize how you're going to protect whatever it is that where you work or what you're in charge of. What do you have? Raise up hands of who's in academia. Who's in industry? Okay. And who are keys on the keyboard, hands-on keyboard developer types? A lot of you, okay? It's an unusual audience for me. So the adversaries are using built-in tools that already exist in the system, and you should assume breach. You need to behave as if your environment is breached, because 5 times out of 10 it is, and that a threat actor is surveilling your system and trying to persist, because persistence is number one. That means staying in the system undetected over time. So impaired defense, I mentioned that at the beginning of the talk, and I just wanted to read you a few, not all of these, of the sub techniques in MITRE ATT&CK. MITRE ATT&CK is, there's a company called MITRE, and it has a lexicon or vocabulary to describe how threat actors are doing their work. That's all it is. It's like a dictionary, right? And so you'll know what these mean when I read some of these attack techniques. Disable or modify tools, disable Windows event logging, disable or modify the firewall, impair command history logging, indicator blocking. So I'm not going to read them all, but what you see here is the third most prevalent set of attack techniques by threat actors last year that had a 330% increase from the year before. What does this say to us about how we counter these techniques to impair the firewall, delete the logs? Yeah, this is sophisticated. And this is just the prevalence of these impaired defenses techniques. And you can see how it has skyrocketed just even the past 3 years. So the hacker community, the bad guys, whether they be, Russian gangs or state-sponsored hackers from China, Russia, and now Iran is rising, and North Korea, state-sponsored groups are really using these techniques to get into the system and to persist. Now, I wanted to show you 2 findings that our company has discovered personally for our own company, because when you are a software company that makes backups and your customer is compromised or breached for whatever reason, you're going to dig in and want to ask what happened. And so what we're finding is that threat actors are surveilling the system, and they're asking, how can we, at the time of our choosing, do the greatest damage? We call that blast radius in the military. And they're looking for an application that they can disable at the time of their choosing that will cause the victim to just be unable to do anything. And so if you were a threat actor, wouldn't you try and disable the backups? So I've been brought into Veritas to help increase security culture for the company, to teach everyone from the salesperson to the sales engineer who's customer facing to the engineering team what's happening here, and to try and create some cross-functional teaming. We created a G5 organization, for example, to get all these people together to communicate and work together better, just as we heard from the talk this morning. So we're finding that the backup systems are being targeted and that the threat actors are using commands that are specific for our application. This is not just a Veritas issue. This is a critical IT applications issue. The second thing we discovered, and I called it organizational exploit. And the story, the real life story from about a year ago, is that we had a customer in retail, West Coast, not naming names. And what happened is that the threat actors got into the network, were not discovered, and they started to delete the backup systems. So, gone. And they were doing the work on Saturday, 3 a.m. So the Security Operations Center saw no problem with this because backup activity occurs in the middle of the night. This is just normal maintenance. If only the backup team and the IT team had gone over to the security operations team at some point, hopefully with a regular cadence, and said, our backups occur Friday, 10 p.m., and they should be completed in 5 minutes. Then the security ops team would have caught that as an anomaly. That because the 2 organizations, IT and security, did not talk, the organization was vulnerable and suffered destruction of their backups. So we were fortunately able to help them recover because they did have an immutable copy, in other words, cannot be changed, that was on the cloud. It was stored in a distant place on a different medium. It's very helpful in thwarting attackers. So as I was preparing my paper, I just Google searched for an image of chaos, because chaos engineering means throughout your process of whatever it is, that you throw in some kinks or monkey wrenches in, and you try and disrupt that process. And in doing that disruption, it makes the process more robust. The process itself is tested. So I am not going to talk about all of this, but I would like to explain our SecDevOps process. We call it the ASAP, application security process. And I did work with our engineering team. This is not my content, okay? This is for you in collaboration with our engineering team to share. Most of this will be familiar. This is not a linear process, okay? It's depicted as such, but once I start to explain it, you'll understand that it's not. So first of all, training is very important. And the training is role-based training of our engineers. So that training really depends on where they sit in the organization. It should be targeted and specific. PSG presents security presentations. So we have a group called PSG, the Product Security Group. If you work for a software company, you're making a product and you're selling your product to customers. If you consult and you deliver services, the services are delivered to clients. Clients get services, customers get products. I learned this. Okay, so that's why we say we have customers, because we sell a product, a number of products. I think probably the best known one is called Net Backup, been around a long time. It's very useful. It works for on-prem. So you got a good old-fashioned, piece of material that's a network server, and that's where you're storing your backups. Works for on-prem. It also orchestrates backup and recovery for cloud environments for Azure and AWS. We're working on Google. And it also provides an integrated view so that if you are in a hybrid or multi-cloud environment, then you can see the status of that backing up in an integrated view. What about Kubernetes? Who is familiar with Kubernetes? Oh man, you guys are much more advanced than me. So what I'll share is that it works within Kubernetes containers or on bare metal. So the beauty of the product is that, and I'm not selling, I'm just explaining what it does and how it works, is that it's a lot of flexibility, which is great because really no two environments are alike when it comes to how organizations, banks, et cetera, are storing their data. So this product security group creates a natural friction with engineering, okay? They are the traffic cop, and they don't necessarily have a warm fuzzy with one another because the product security group says, stop. Have you done this test? Have you done this validation? No. You're going to prioritize security over new features, engineering team. And you can see how if you're trying to sell software, that there can be that natural friction between the sales folks, the engineering team, and product security group. Requirements are another element in this nonlinear process. When you sell to the federal government or the UK government or to Japan or a Japanese automotive company, there are a lot of requirements about the software. Some companies ask for a software bill of materials. That can be challenging because software companies, for an appropriate SBOM, would include who developed the software, where are they, and a lot of details that could be proprietary or competition specific. In the design, you can see we use an architectural risk analysis, threat modeling. We look at cryptography that cannot be overcome by quantum. So it's very important to be modern in your cryptographic methods. For testing, we perform attack surface enumeration and dynamic security testing. We have external pen testers and internal pen test teams. We don't hire the same pen testers. We rotate through who is externally testing. And we have our own cyber range called the Red Lab that I'd like to talk about. Again, we perceive the backup as being a prime target, so we take security very seriously. And we fine-tune our defense mechanisms, and we study new attack vectors, and we adjust to these new threats. It is a constantly evolving set of processes and tools. Not very glamorous, but I'm sure you'll give us a pass. Our Red Lab is in Pune, India. It is not connected to the internet. And, you know, it's just bare bones basic, but I wanted you to see that that is where we release live malware samples and see how they interact with our software to really see where the vulnerabilities are or could be. I don't expect you to read this. NBU is net backup, and this is just some sample data of different malware samples that we've tested, and do certain antivirus systems work. This allows us to perform independent research. And again, our own cyber range, the military have a gun range, right? They can test if they hit their target. So a cyber range is very similar. As you have your target, which is net backup, and then you shoot at it with all kinds of attack vectors. So back here, and I'm almost out of time in order to create space for questions. Over to the deploy and maintain, that's super important. And the take-home message, of course, is that for every minute that a patch is not applied, threat actors have become very savvy about casing the joint, scoping out what they want to attack, and then looking for that opportunity of a time gap between vulnerability is known and then their ability to exploit that. It's almost like a crack in the door. So when I worked at CISA and there were known vulnerabilities that needed to be patched, that was pushed. Like there was no, well, from the end user perspective, there was no opting in. There was no, we're going to delay, you know, just set it for later tonight. So we have third-party component security review. We have rigor in our packaging of the software and the signing of the code. Secure by default means that controls like multi-factor authentication, you don't uncheck a box like that's on. You don't have a choice. And in some destructive operations, like deleting the backups, we have a multi-person authorization, like the nuclear weapons keys, that you need more than one person to be able to deploy that destruction. We think backups are that important. And really, that's all that I had prepared today, because I wanted us to have lots of time for dialogue, and I will do my best to answer any questions you may have. We have one in front.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. Very interesting. I guess I'm wondering if you have some maybe high level advice for a small company, like, you know, startup level, where to start.
Yes. I always think of a framework of people and processes and technology. You have, as in military, a belly button for the role. You have someone who it's their job to be accountable for security. That's the start. The process is, does that person or team have any kind of process by which they are thinking about the security of the system? I would recommend something as simple as the NIST cybersecurity framework, which is just 5 words that are like identify the threat, protect, defend, I forget what recover. So it's kind of like, what is our recovery strategy? You know, how are we detecting the threat actors in the system? What's our process if we do get hacked? Of how what
What was the framework?
NIST, so the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, cybersecurity framework. Now, if you want to go military style and be really bare bones, boom is the term military uses for the explosion. And we go left of boom, boom, and right of boom. So if we're left of boom, what's our endpoint detection? What's our firewall? How are we preventing? How are we, or even if we don't have those tools in place, so for example, for me, I set up my own consulting company some time ago, and I wanted to put up a website. How do I trust that whoever I'm going to host my website is secure? So I go and I read reviews by reputable third-party organizations that say, yeah, this company is a good provisioner of sites and better than, you know, others. So just a little due diligence in how you prioritize. And I would say if it's a really small company of, let's say, 3 people, that those people at least have some training. And the training can be as simple as a once a year, 1 hour conversation about key threats that they need to be aware of, so that at all costs you can prevent that clicking of the link. Or I would say if it's a startup, what do you have that's most valuable? Your idea. So the theft of your property, the confiscation of your intellectual property is the thing that hackers would want the most. Okay, question?
Yeah, do you know a framework or a basic framework that to identify the appropriate level of security measures in a space? So like the company I work for, we make electrical engineering software we contract the government and all sorts of stuff. So but as far as figuring out what's the appropriate level of security for our program, period, so that hackers can't, exploit our program to get into it.
I would ask who you're selling to. Ask yourself, who is our ultimate buyer? If your ultimate buyer is the US Navy, you need to somehow figure out what are the Navy's requirements for secure systems. That's a longer answer that we could talk about, but who's going to buy it? And then set the requirements appropriately. And where will it operate? So if it's going to operate in a cloud and the Navy's going to buy it, you're going to get into something called CMMC, which is a lot of security controls for operating in cloud environments with the military. So I do this not only in considering selling software to the US government, but other governments. And let's say, the UK, Japan, Australia, they're quite advanced in their knowledge of security practices and the requirements that you as a company must fulfill in order to sell your product to them or services. Jen.
When you talk about the military being scripted, Richard Feynman was in my department. The joke was that he stole the atomic bomb secret, but not the original copy. It was a copy that the scientists kept. So how do you deal with that institutional issue that you have a very rigid, very deep set of security measures, but by being rigid, there's an alternate path? And then the other question is, you mentioned the blast radius. And if you look at Israel blowing up the pager, those things were done years ago. So I think some of the greatest, best hackers actually sit silent. They're not there to compromise. They're monitoring until they want to act.
Yes.
And so I was kind of surprised by the comment that people are looking for blast radius and you can identify it. Because I think some of them are actually in the back.
Agree. So I'm going to address your second point first, and then I'll go into military culture. Threat actors, especially nation state, especially China, have moved from surveillance to the potential for destruction. So 2 marches ago, the US Navy discovered some software injected into its sensitive communication systems. Why does Navy care so much about comms? Because if you're a ship in the Pacific and you're in a battle group and GPS is denied, how are you going to communicate? You better have some plan B and a plan C. This is why you hear these silly articles about Navy people training by looking at the stars as an alternate because they need backup training. So the military, you can't be, unprepared. So communication is paramount, which is why the military prizes simple communication because there is lower risk of an error in the transmission of that communication. Because if there's an error in communication, there can be disastrous impacts. There's a risk analysis involved there. Further, the military is rigid because it is a large organization. And think about if you have a battle group of ships conducting something in the Pacific or wherever, and there's different kind of ships, and one ship might be an aircraft carrier, and there's 2,000 people living there, and each of them has a mission that they're trying to do and is a specialist in what they do. Well, let's say one of them decides that I'm just going to read comic books today. I'm not feeling well. I'm just not going to do my job, or I'm going to do something else. You have to have everybody working in unison in order to have an optimally performing team. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't pivot if you don't need to, but that is the commander's decision. And the commander is the commander because they have been tested through battle after battle scenarios, refining communication, understanding strategy, know the history, military history of things that went wrong and how we don't repeat that. So that's why military is very strict, is to be able to avoid miscommunication and chaos when organization is really needed to perform the mission. Does that make sense? That's why. I didn't understand that when I came to the OD, but over time I grew to really appreciate that. We have 5 minutes, so we have time for maybe 2 more questions.
So as a person who kind of gets to the progress to a lot of this, what are the reasons
That are what?
that keep you up at night?
The growing and deepening relationship between nation states that do not respect international norms of behavior and commerce. Because they're very well funded. And if they collaborate, then what one is really good at is shared with another. And that really creates an exponential problem in terms of risk, security risk. And I'm not just saying cybersecurity. I think we need to get beyond cybersecurity and just talk about security because it's all coming together. I think there should be a chief security officer for every company rather than a chief information security officer, because the doors are now digitized and the physical fence periphery is now digitized. So it all comes together. That's my single answer. Any other? One more?
You had mentioned about S-bombs and the kind of lack of motivation of providing one based on companies for proprietary information. I was wondering if do you have any suggestions on perhaps mitigations for it for companies that may not want to produce it? I'm thinking of like Log4j from happening again and being able to scan for existing problems.
Yes. Yes. So I'll give you an example. This is Chatham House rules, not for disclosure. We have banks that have asked for our SBOM. So we have them sign a non-disclosure agreement that is beyond the non-disclosure agreement they already have with us to do business. And the banks, they develop their own software. They're rich. They don't have to buy a lot of tools. They do, but they can just code up their own. They have the resources to do it. So they have binary code scanners and things like that they can really tell what's in there, how long ago it was made, other signatures, So it really is right now a business to business kind of interaction. I think it will become more standardized in time, but from an industry perspective, am glad that government is trying to work with industry toward an outcome that is able to be performed and doesn't make the company providing the SBOM or the customer more vulnerable because of open disclosure of things that could be vulnerabilities. Because as you know, code ain't clean. No code is totally free of vulnerabilities unless you write a tiny little piece yourself. And even then, it could be, you just don't know it yet. That's just the world that we live in. I'm happy for dialogue after this, but I want you to have some time for a break. So thanks again for attending today.